So the problems at Reading Football Club has really troubled me as an outsider for a long time. So I can't imagine how Reading fans have been feeling about the ongoing issues with Dai Yong, the overinvestment from previous years, the loss of 21 odd million from the 22-23 season based on the accounts, the reliance on agent-led recruitment, the lack of communication, all sorts of massive problems with Dai Yong's ownership over several years now. It's got to come to an end at some point. It looks like the EFL have had enough. They've said that Dai Yong has been disqualified from their owners and directors test. A little bit late, you might argue, but better late than never, of course. He's been given until the 4th of April, so this Friday, to sell the club, or the Royals will risk being disqualified, suspended from League One. How that's going to work, I've absolutely no idea. Whether there's even substance behind that, or whether that's an element of teachers telling their kids to finish their lunch for, or they won't do X, Y, Z. I don't know what the situation is, but what we do think we know is that Reading are in exclusivity talks with Robert Platek, a US finance businessman who also owns a club in Portugal, while Rob Cohig still remains on the scene. So plenty to discuss. Where do Reading go from here? That's what we're going to try and get through on this League One podcast special on Reading FC. Yes, welcome along to EFL Debate. Before we get started, if you enjoy these episodes, you can do us a massive favour by getting subscribed to EFL Debate on YouTube and on Spotify. That would help us out an awful lot. For now, I'm delighted to be joined by Becky Trotman from Sell Before We Die. Becky, the one thing that I am quite encouraged about, to start on a positive, I'm sure we'll get on to the negatives, is that Robert Platek, who seems to be the one in exclusivity talks at this stage, does seem to have a decent background. He owns another club. He's got some experience in football. Would you hope, without knowing loads at this stage, that he could be somebody to give the club some much needed stability?
Yeah, absolutely, Gabe. Thanks ever so much for having me on, and obviously continuing to keep our problems in the spotlight. I think obviously, somebody coming in that's got experience within football would be very welcome, although with the caveat that Dai Younger did own 2 football clubs before he owned Reading, so you could say had experience in football. Sadly, he liquidated both of them, and it's obviously becoming very obvious to us now how and why that came to be. But yeah, I think kind of many of us are now at this place where, regardless of who the new owner is, it's get die out. We can't, beggars can't be choosers, essentially, and I think anybody who comes in that isn't Dai Younger will be a welcome addition to Reading Football Club. And really, we don't know a huge amount about Robert Platek beyond obviously what we've been able to read online about his dealings with other clubs. One not quite so successful as we understand, but obviously his current experience with the club in Portugal seems to be very positive. We don't know, we've not officially been told by anybody that he is the party in exclusivity. That seems to be just the general consensus from various people in the media, essentially. But if it is him, we obviously haven't really heard anything about what his plans would be for the future of Reading. But at the moment, I think it's just welcome news that there is at least still talks ongoing with a potential buyer. And we hope that we don't get news later this week that's no longer the case. I think as long as there's somebody at the table and the conversations are ongoing, that's always a positive.
Certainly is. I seem to remember, Becky, I think it might have been on the 25th of February, there was an extremely hopeful update regarding the progress made of a sale for Reading FC. There hasn't been any real sort of positive movement on that, I wouldn't say, in the subsequent 2 weeks or so. Is there part of you, given that we've been burnt in, or you've been burnt in the past by positive signs that haven't quite sort of fleshed out as such. That maybe how concrete that statement was.
Yeah, nobody gets carried away anymore. As you say, we've been in this position several times with, I think it's 5 periods of exclusivity now. I think this is the fifth. The previous four clearly haven't resulted in a sale. So nobody's getting overexcited or carried away by this. There's still, as we understand it, quite a lot of things to be sorted out, and as I'm sure we'll come onto in a bit, there's the Rob Couig kind of still being on the scene element of
Sure.
things, which is essentially making a very complicated situation even more complicated. But yeah, I think we're not sure when the period of exclusivity that they currently have is due to expire. But I think yeah, we just want that ongoing communication from the club, really, that things are going in the right direction. I think, to be fair, we've got to a point now where the communications that come from the club are taken with a little bit of a pinch of salt by many fans. We've been told for over 500 days now that Die Younger is committed to selling the club. Their version of committed and mine don't stack up. Yeah, we've seen very little in the way of evidence that he's actually committed to anything, to be quite honest. But yeah, I think it's important. I think the club have at least acknowledged in the last few months that they do need to keep fans updated, and sometimes those updates are a little bit more useful than others. Sometimes it's words for the sake of words. But yeah, I think certainly, as you say, there's a deadline looming at the end of this week with regards to the timing that's been put on Die to divest his shares in the club. And I think that the club most certainly will have to come out sometime between now and Saturday with some communication to fans on where that's all got to.
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned that situation with the EFL where their position is you've got to have sold by this Friday, or in a couple of weeks as it would have been at the time, because I've got this horrible feeling in the pit of my stomach that there's not going to have been that move. But I mean, we're Wednesday. Like, there might be a magical announcement tomorrow. It's late Wednesday afternoon as we record. There might be an amazing announcement tomorrow, but there's this feeling that, for me, that we're going to get to Friday and nothing's changed. And I don't know what the EFL are going to do, because it feels a little bit like they're saying you're going to be suspended, from League One if you don't sell the club. But is that really going to benefit the EFL? Because there's going to be all sorts of sporting implications for Reading not competing in League One, and number of games, and how do you balance
absolutely that would open all sorts of cans of worms, and I think the EFL will avoid having to do that for exactly the reasons you say. What happens to the remaining 7 games that Reading are due to play? Do the points just get handed to the other teams? What happens if I'm a season ticket holder? What happens to the money that I've handed over for the games that I don't get to go to? Yeah, it would open up a huge can of worms. I think you're right that there probably isn't going to be any kind of magical progress made in the next couple of days with regards to the actual sale of the club. The EFL have said, however, that if they can see evidence that a sale is progressing, then they would consider extending that period in which Die Younger has to essentially sell and divest his shares. So I think at the moment that is probably the most likely / easiest option for the EFL to take. However, if they genuinely, I guess, can't see any evidence that any sort of progress is being made at all, then that puts them in quite a difficult situation in terms of, do they act on that threat? And then it obviously creates a huge amount of work for them to deal with the consequences and the fallout of that. So yeah, as I say, I think the most likely and easiest option for the EFL come the end of this week will be to kick the can a bit further down the road and try and give him a bit longer. As fans, obviously the last thing we want is for our season to be suspended. We're in a great position at the moment, just sitting a point outside of the playoffs. We were still in the playoffs at one point last night, and then I think Bolton popped up with a late goal that popped us back down into seventh. But regardless of that, it would be awful for us now after having had a surprisingly brilliant season, for it all to essentially have ended last night, and that kind of be as far as we go this season. So we want the sale to happen. Obviously, we want things to go through, but I think the EFL, everybody's been patient for long enough, and we just need the right people to act like grown-ups and get it sorted, and the EFL to also kind of play their part and make sure things work out well for the benefit of Reading Football Club, its staff and its fans.
I think, though, the problem you have, Becky, is that the EFL, I think they like to act as though they have control over the situation, but I think they can only project sort of an illusion of control. I think in terms of what they would actually need, they would need some sort of government approval, like the independent regulator, which hasn't come in yet, and that's been talked about for years, it feels like. I don't know. I think really the EFL are just a collection of 72 clubs and a few people upstairs. They don't really have any financial power. They don't really have any legal power. So really them saying, you've got to sort of sold by this point, they're competition organisers, but sometimes the way that the EFL are spoken about, it's as if they're a governing body, but I don't think they really are.
No, I think the amount of clout that they have is, in fairness, fairly limited. I think they obviously have their rule book that they will, cite section A, B, and C out of. I think we're the first kind of case really that's come along where that rule book's being tested to its limits. I think they admitted in a conversation with our supporters trust last week that they've not been in this position before. I think previously they might have made threats to owners about suspension, and it actually works because they're owners who perhaps have got themselves into a bit of a mess with money, but still do care about the club that they own at the end of the day. That's not the case with Reading, as has quite clearly been seen by the 18 points that we've been deducted over the course of the 3 seasons up until last year. Having that kind of stick to be our particular owner with was never going to make any difference, because he doesn't give a damn about where we are in the league, and getting points deducted. So, and I think it's something fairly similar with the threat of suspension. He doesn't give a toss whether we turn up and play against Wycombe on Saturday at the SCL or not. It makes zero difference to him. If we don't kick another ball this season and end up finishing, 7 places lower down the league than we are at the moment because we don't have the opportunity to accrue any more points, doesn't care. So I don't really see what that threat of suspension, I don't see how that's going to make any difference to Dai Younger in terms of getting him to actually sign on the line and sell the club to someone. I think we've also got to remember as well that his financial problems clearly extend way beyond Reading Football Club. While this is the key priority for us as fans, and obviously for everybody connected to the club, for him, potentially, this is just one relatively small piece of a very big jigsaw, and not necessarily top of his priority list when it comes to sorting out the mess that he's got himself into.
Do we know what his situation is and how whether that affects Reading's situation in terms of Dai Young's other businesses?
We don't believe that any of the debt that he's alleged to be in China now is a problem for the club. It was at one point when he had a very big loan secured against our stadium. We're led to believe that's now been resolved. So his other financial problems shouldn't have a direct bearing on somebody coming in and buying Reading. I think it's just a matter of him having so many plates spinning and so many different individual messes to sort out that we would be foolish to think that his sole focus is on the sale of Reading Football Club, because it won't be.
Yeah, absolutely. Becky, I wanted to ask you about how Rob Coig is perceived among Reading fans, because I'm coming at this from the point of view of studied his brilliant work at Wycombe Wanderers, where he took over when, although they were actually doing very well on the pitch at the time, they were owned by the Supporters Trust, who were very limited financially in what they could do, and he took them from a point of view where they were really struggling financially and had one of the lowest budgets in League One, and just grew the club, put a bit more into the playing budget, but invested a lot in infrastructure. He invested in a B team at Wycombe Wanderers where they'd had nothing really below the first team. They'd had to scrap the academy and didn't have any even reserve teams or anything like that. So he put together a really strong long-term plan that helped Wycombe Wanderers go from being a supporter-owned club in 2019, which has real limitations at League One level, to being able to sell the club to a Kazakhstani billionaire in 2024, 5 years later. So I've got a very positive view of Rob Coig. I think he's a very transparent person and very happy to communicate. And I think he sees the importance of infrastructure in clubs and not just what's there right now on the pitch. So I actually really like him. However, I've noticed that some Reading fans maybe don't quite share my my view of him.
Yeah, I think everything you've said was very much kind of the Reading fans' view. Obviously, we got to a point last summer where we were very, very close to Rob becoming our new owner, to a point where he was seen attending games. He was photographed at our training ground, for
Sell
example.
Bay as well.
Yeah, and people were glad he was going to be welcomed with open arms for the reason that you said. We'd heard a lot of positive things from Wycombe fans, particularly around his transparency and communication with fans, which is something that we've had absolutely nothing from Dai Young since the day he walked in the door. So that was all going to be very welcomed. I think people could see that he would be a good fit for Reading, and he was a man with a plan, and that was exactly what we wanted. Obviously, that all fell apart when Dai Young, for whatever reason, decided he wasn't going to sell the club to Rob Coig, and a legal battle and all sorts of other complications have cropped up since, particularly with regards to securities that Rob Coig now holds over various parts of the club. For example, certain shares, the stadium, the training ground, for example, which if you listen to what he's been saying, is there very much to protect what he believes he is rightfully owed by Reading Football Club for them having breached exclusivity, for example, and essentially kind of led him to a point where, to all intents and purposes, he was going to be the owner of Reading Football Club, and then, a few hours later wasn't. So this whole battle has been kind of played out reasonably publicly over the last few months. And I think part of the issue is that we've got Rob Coig, who up until last week wasn't really saying anything, and has now been extremely vocal on various podcasts, media interviews in the last week to 10 days. We're still getting relatively little information from the club, and certainly nothing by way of detail or names. So fans are being kind of left to form their own opinions based on very little in the way of hard facts. The club did put out a narrative. It was straight after our away game at Crawley last month, that was kind of put out through the local media, that essentially said that Coig was blocking a sale, and all the time that he held these securities, a sale wouldn't be able to take place. So fans automatically would think, bad man, stopping the sale, this is his fault. It's since been said by a judge in a court of law that isn't the case, and actually the securities that he's got do not legally prevent the sale of a club. He said the same himself in the various media interviews, podcast interviews that he's done in the last couple of weeks. But naturally, there are still some ill feelings towards him, because he is still here. He's still essentially kind of casting a bit of a shadow over this process. And there's been this lack of kind of updates, transparency over exactly what's going on. So I think the fan base is quite divided over Rob Couhig at the moment. If he were to end up buying the club from Dai Young, getting the club by default through obviously having these securities there that end up coming into play, do I think people would still be glad just to see the back of Dai Younger in the grand scheme of things? Yes, I do. I think if he was to come in, and same for Rob Playtech as well, we want somebody to come in, be open and transparent with fans about what their plan for the club is, and actually do what they say they're going to do. So regardless of whether it's Rob Couhig, Rob Platek, or whoever else, that's what we want, that's what we need. And I think if somebody comes in and does that, then they will be seen favourably by Reading fans.
Yeah, absolutely. It's hard. It's the lack of transparency thing is a difficult one. I think for me, I'm very mindful, Becky, that in terms of takeovers, a lot of the time the information is very sensitive. So if you're trying to do a deal with Dai Young, it's not necessarily going to be in your interests to share everything.
Absolutely.
And the mistake that Rob's made probably previously is that he had tried to share things and take photos and sort of hint that things were happening, and that was almost his sort of undoing.
Yep, absolutely. And I think we've kind of said to the club all along that, we understand that there are pieces of information that you can't give us.
Yeah.
But what we've faced for the last, certainly 18 months now since the club was put up for sale is this, well, we can't tell you anything because, it's all legally sensitive. And it's as if they've kind of hidden behind this, well, no, we're in exclusivity, so we can't tell you anything.
Yeah.
And as a group of supporters, we're not stupid. We get that there are certain things that they can't tell us, but we know full well there are things that they can, but are just choosing not to. And that's where this kind of lack of trust has come from, and B, people like Rob Couhig will come out and say certain things, and some people will believe him. Some people will say he's a liar because it doesn't tally with the little snippets of information we have been given by the club. And it just leaves fans feeling hugely frustrated. We don't know who to trust. We don't know who to believe because it feels like we're being given various versions of the truth by different people. Yeah, and it's really, really frustrating just not to know what's going on and what information to turn to and who to believe, really. I think the update that the club really need to give this week will be quite telling in terms of the level of information that they're willing to divulge in that. And I think, the message to them really will be they need to start being honest with fans. This constant, Dai Younger's committed to selling just doesn't wash anymore. We need something more.
100%. It does feel like it's all coming to a head where either there will be this miraculous takeover on Thursday or Friday, or there'll have to be some sort of statement or recognition that the club hasn't been able to honour what it was committed to doing, because of the date that had been given. So hopefully there will be some sort of statement from the club that sort of reflects the state of play a little bit more truthfully.
Yeah, there definitely needs to be something. And, as soon as you've got kind of deadlines and dates given out for things, then that's the time where expectations are at their highest, and people just need to know what's going on. So I think, for the club and probably the EFL as well are going to need to come out and say something. I think they're intending to after a meeting that they've got scheduled on Thursday. It's important that both of those, the EFL and Reading Football Club, are letting fans know what's going on. We're due to kick off against Wycombe Wanderers at 12:30 on Saturday lunchtime, and at the moment there's question marks over whether that's even going to happen. And people are buying tickets, and as a group, Sell Before We Die, our kind of campaigning work, I suppose, this week has been quite focused on just trying to get people to come to games and back Noel Hunt and the team to do the business on the pitch, because it feels like that's really the only thing that we've got any control over at the moment.
Absolutely. I wanted to give a mention to Select Car Leasing because I think sometimes I can remember being on this podcast before. I mentioned it as the Select Car Leasing Stadium, and the reaction from a non-Reading fan was another spot, sponsored stadium. But I think what's really important to recognise is that Select Car have actually been very helpful to Reading Football Club during this uncertain time. I've got a feeling when there were some unpaid wage bills, they actually stepped in, which is a really noble and admirable thing to do. So I think it's great that Reading fans seem to have recognised them, that they've been part of the fight.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a bit like you say, some of the other people that listen to the pod will say when we were told that our beloved Madejski Stadium was going to be renamed the Select Car Leasing Stadium. Most fans were a bit over our dead bodies. We'll still call it what we want to call it. At the end of the day, nobody stopped calling St James's Park St James's Park and started calling it the Sports Direct Stadium. It was still St James's Park. So in our minds, the Madejski Stadium, the Madstad, as we liked to call it, would always remain as such, regardless of who sponsored it. Then, as you say, Select Car Leasing have just been brilliant throughout all of this, in terms of a local business, regardless of their links with Reading Football Club. Their kind of corporate social value stock is very high with a lot of the initiatives that they do locally. But as you say, stepping in and covering kind of everyday running costs of the football club is way above and beyond what a sponsor should ever be expected to do. They didn't come out and make it public that was the case. They weren't in it for reputational gain. As we understand it, the two guys that actually own the company are both Reading fans, and essentially it was a case, we believe, of two people who love the club as much as the rest of us. I certainly don't have the kind of money to put in to cover off the wage bill, but they did. And yeah, it's brilliant. And I just hope, again, regardless of who the new owner is, whichever of the two Robs or whoever else might come in, I hope that they recognise what Select Car Leasing have actually done for Reading Football Club over the last 3 or 4 years that they've been with us, and that talks can continue to keep them on board. And Reading fans by and large now do refer to our stadium not as the Select Car Leasing. It's a bit of a mouthful. It tends to be the SCL. But we have got to a point where actually, because they've been so fantastic, we are willing to use their name when we're referring to our stadium nowadays.
Yeah, absolutely. I hope they get rewarded under the new ownership as well for that. What was I going to say? I feel like as much as this has been such a turbulent time for Reading because of all the reasons we've mentioned, Becky, I also think that oddly the club is actually in a decent position for if the takeover does go through, because I don't see a situation where the club needs a massive rebuild, because in terms of infrastructure, the facilities, I'm led to believe, are actually pretty good. In terms of the youth setup, you've been able to produce a lot of players that have been able to come through and develop. You've got a very talented coach in charge, I think it seems, in Noel Hunt, who's done a fantastic job in really difficult circumstances. So as much as it's maybe not the focus right now, because the focus is obviously ownership, it does seem like there's a lot of positives to build on under the next ownership regime.
Yeah, there absolutely is. There's a huge amount of potential in Reading Football Club. And I think, the fact that there's clearly been a lot of interest from potential buyers, albeit Mr. Dai hasn't, signed on the line and actually handed the club over to any of them, is a good sign that other people see the potential in Reading Football Club that we see. I would argue in terms of facilities and infrastructure, it's not as good as it could be. Yes, we've got a very shiny training ground. In terms of the stadium itself, the SCL needs quite a lot of work. There's been times this season where our pitch has been an absolute disgrace, reportedly because they can't afford to pay for the lighting that we would ordinarily have over the grass through the winter months. To keep it nice and healthy. It's looking a bit better actually at the moment, I think, because we've had less rain and a bit of sun in the last couple of weeks. There's a huge amount of work needs doing to get the stadium back to where it should be. The toilet facilities aren't particularly great. The place needs a good lick of paint. But these are all fairly quick wins in the grand scheme of things, and certainly shouldn't be things that would put anybody off buying Reading Football Club. As you say, our academy's category 1 status, and if it hadn't been for the lads coming out of that academy in the last couple of seasons, we wouldn't have had enough people to be fielding 11 men on the pitch at the start of a game. So we've relied on the academy massively. Some of the boys from there have done a fantastic job. We've got Andre Garcia, he's only 17 years old, has started, most games, I think, this season now. It's just crazy. And I think we forget how young they actually are. Occasionally, that will show in terms of some of the mistakes that are made on the pitch. But yeah, without the academy, we would have been in an even bigger mess. The training ground is obviously the jewel in our crown, if you like. We've got training facilities that are up there and even better, arguably, than some of the 20 teams in the Premier League at the moment. So there's a huge amount of potential. And I think in terms of whoever the new owner is, there's some fairly quick wins that can be made in terms of, like I say, just improving some of the facilities at the stadium, sorting the pitch out. That somebody can come in and actually make a real difference reasonably quickly to Reading. It is quite concerning. We've only got 5 first-team players under contract as of this summer, so whoever comes in will need to look quite quickly at bringing new players on board and, not just relying on people coming out of our own academy. So that's quite worrying and a bit of a kind of looming disaster, if you like, if we don't get a new owner.
If the situation stays as it is, where's the money going to come from?
Yeah, absolutely. It won't come from anywhere. Even the fact that, hopefully we won't be under a transfer embargo by the time the window opens this summer. Even if we still had Di Younger in charge, he's not coughing up any money for any players. So we really need a new owner to come in. We need to make sure that the latest set of accounts get published in good time, so that we don't get put back under an embargo for lack of financial transparency. And then the new owner, one of their first tasks really will be to work with Noel Hunt and hopefully Brian Carey as well, who out of the kind of leadership team at Reading has been one of the few people who we feel has actually done things in the best interests of Reading Football Club in recent years.
What's Brian's role? Sorry, Becky.
His looks after our recruitment. So some of the players, bringing in people like Harvey Nibbs, Sam Smith, who obviously we've then sold on to Wrexham recently. But he's uncovered some fantastic players who are performing week in, week out for us with zero money. We've not been able to pay a transfer fee for anybody for several years now. So what he's done has been brilliant. So I would hope that the new owner that comes in will listen to him, listen to Noel, and just give them the financial backing to build a good team for next season. Obviously, we say that with the caveat of it needs to be sustainable. We don't want somebody to just come in and chuck silly sums of money at bang average players, which is essentially how we got into this mess in the first place. Yeah. But somebody will need to put their hand in their pocket, certainly, to look at padding out our squad.
Absolutely, yeah. A big couple of days ahead for Reading, but certainly a big couple of months as well, depending on what happens. So, yeah, it rumbles on. But thanks so much for talking to us, Becky, and yeah, best wishes.
Thanks ever so much, Gabe. Hopefully, I'll speak to you with sort of more positive news next time.
Let's hope so. Everyone, thanks for watching, and you can get subscribed to EFL Debate on YouTube and on Spotify.